First of all, welcome to the pod. It's great to have you on,
Thanks.
Brian.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Now, Brian, you've been building companies for a long time now. This is not your first rodeo at this point, and I've been fortunate, for full disclosure here, to be an investor in now your second company. So I got to, I invested in the first company. Full circle here because I remember Alex Torrenegra called me. You were on Shark Tank. I don't think you actually presented, but your co-founders did on Shark Tank, and then that's how I found out from Alex. And then full circle, now I'm actually on Shark Tank as an investor in Mexico. But tell our audience a little bit more about kind of your background. And you're not from Latin America. So there's two things we have in common, both named Brian, I guess three, building tech companies and not from Latin America, but love Latin America. But you have some roots from Latin America. And I'd love for you just to share your personal story, because I think it's a fascinating one, on how you ended up in Colombia from Boston.
Yeah. Well, I am from Latin America. I was actually born on the streets of Bogota, and I was abandoned into an orphanage in Bogota. And so at 2 weeks old, I was adopted. My parents from Massachusetts flew down, had to spend a few weeks, a month going to like the court, doing the paperwork. Then they took me back to Boston. By the time I got back to Boston, I was 2 months old. I was born in September. I arrived in November, close to Thanksgiving. And it was in a town it's south of Boston, 20 minutes south. It's a town called Norwell, and predominantly white. And I always wanted to know why I was different, why I was adopted. So that's kind of why it was rooted for me to always go back to Latin America. So I grew up in the States, and got fortunate. Grew up with a very nice family. My mother and father, and my brother and sisters went to school in Vermont. So yeah, grew up in the States, but I am from Colombia.
That's a fascinating story. So you ended going back to kind of like meet your birth mother. And how old were you when you went back to Colombia?
I was like 36.
Okay, so 36. You just had this kind of desire to go back, and that brought you back. Tell us about those first, that first month or two. Like, you land back in Colombia. You don't speak Spanish. Like, you're Colombian, but you're like, this is not what I'm used to. Walk us through kind of what it was like to be back in Colombia and that part of your journey.
Yeah, so I've always been driven to go back. And so my sister was also adopted from the same orphanage, not blood related, but we were adopted from the same orphanage, 3 years apart. Obviously grew up in the same house. She's my sister. And for some strange reason, like the orphanage called Fana, they had a really great satellite office in Boston, because there's still a ton of other Colombians running around in the south of Boston, even in New England as a whole. I ended up going to college. I played soccer at this small little Catholic school. I ended up playing on the same soccer team as another kid my same age that was adopted from the same orphanage. And everyone I met really didn't have a lot of interest of ever going back. They were super brainwashed, whitewashed, totally fine having grown up and being in the US. But for some reason, I had always had it in me to go back, and had a drive to eventually one day go back. And I've always been primarily in startups as well. Most of my career has been in startups. So started in San Francisco, had exposure to a few startups out there. And then in 2016 was the right time in my life where it's like, okay, I've done 3 startups here, had exposure to 3 startups. I'm in between startups. And so I started to test different startup ideas from San Francisco. I'm really good at having a ton of ideas and launching them really quickly. When I'm in between startups, I just can't help myself but just launch like many startups at the same time and see what takes off. And then whichever one has the best metrics, I kind of dig into a little bit deeper to see if I could get self-conviction, because everything I've done, I've never had any previous experience before, never even thought about it before. Especially when I got into Lyft, I never thought 1 second about supply chain or truck deliveries. But I launched like a truck delivery idea from San Francisco, and that was the idea that just took off. And I created a Facebook page, a Facebook ad. I ran $5 a day against it, and on the first day, had 3 requests to get a truck delivery. So the only person I knew was Felipe Betancourt, who ended up being one of my co-founders. We had like very limited experience working with each other, but he was literally the only person I knew. So I called Felipe up. I'm like, hey man, I got 3 requests to go pick up a couch or a grill at Home Center, which is like the Home Depot of Latin America. Can you find a truck delivery guy and park at Noventa Trace, jump in the truck with him and go to Home Center, pick up the grill and bring it to the apartment? And that's how we kicked things off. And, the next day we had more requests and more requests. And so, maybe there's something here in truck deliveries. Never even thought, had no experience in supply chain. But then you started to dig into it, started to look at the market. And at that time, I also was had conviction to go down back to Colombia to try to find my biological family. So I was mentally prepared to make the move. And so I threw all of my stuff into storage. At the time, I only had 1 child, and now I have 3. But, it's kind of an easy move. And I was more motivated after having 3 startups under my belt or exposure to. That was the time I was going to go down, primarily motivated to find my biological family. But also testing. So the truck delivery idea was taking off, but I also tested multiple other ideas, like a direct-to-consumer button-down shirt idea. I had also just had my first kid, as I just mentioned, and I tested a baby. Well, it wasn't a baby. It was like a Lego subscription for kids, for toddlers idea where you get new Legos in the mail. I tested that out in Bogota. And none of the other ones really got any traction, but Lifted, the truck delivery company, did. So ended up going there, again, primarily driven to have this personal mission to find my biological family. That took me 2 years to accomplish. I tried to find my family by myself. That didn't end up working out. I then had to hire a private investigator, and he had to dig deep to find my family. It took 2 years. But basically, right off the plane, we came came running out to start Lifted. Felipe and I quickly pivoted the business from B2C to B2B, because I had already done a B2C startup and it quickly failed, had done multiple rounds of funding. It failed. I didn't want to do a B2C startup again. It's very exhausting. I'm not that good at those types of businesses either. And so I was like, hey, Felipe, I don't want to have random people ask for trucks every day, but it was, we have had a few weeks of revenue making to get exposure into the business. Let's shift. Let's move to B2B. Let's start knocking on doors and asking businesses how they do their truck deliveries. And that's how we started to get off the ground. That's how I got back into Colombia. And up until recently, actually just 2 weeks ago, I've relocated back to the US. I'm now in San Diego, but the last 7 years been hustling around the streets of Latin America, have lived in multiple countries. And now with 3 kids, I've actually never lived under one roof for more than 1 year since I was 17. And basically the whole time I was in Latin America, I was doing Airbnbs, moving to a new space every month. I'm probably definitely the number one user on Airbnb. Have a ton of everywhere I'm going. I'm just circling through, going in and out of new homes. And so, but that's how I got into Latin America.
Wow, what an incredible journey that you've been on. And you had this kind of mission, you had a personal mission, you were motivated to connect with your family, your biological family. And then at the same time, you're like, well, I might as well, start a company too. And you're very vocal about something around the fact that you believe that Latin America is easier to build a company. I want to double click on that because I think it's a little bit of a contrarian view, because everyone talks about Latin America so hard. There's so much friction. Talk about why you think Latin America is actually easier to build a company than the US. And you've done a handful of companies in the US, so you've got that full perspective.
Yeah. I mean, as a kind of macro level reasons. One is when I did startups in San Francisco, it's basically a lot of it's the same, but what I felt was it was highly competitive. I felt there was just every block you were on, every street you go down, there's a handful of startups, super talented, deep experience. They're all fighting for the same capital. And once you get into a space, it ends up being very crowded, even though at first it doesn't seem that crowded. In the US, you dive in, and 6 months into it, you're like, oh, wow, there's 5 other super hard competitors, and there's 10 other competitors that are pretty good. And so it was really hard to differentiate in the US. And so that's primarily my thinking around why Latin America is easier to build, is because I believe a lot of markets are still untouched today. And in the markets that have a lot of competition, I think you can still get in there and compete. Even calling out the most obvious thing, I still think you could do a food delivery, grocery store delivery food startup in Bogota, even though that's highly crowded. But I think you could actually do that and build an interesting business starting in Bogota where it's crowded and then expanding beyond. And, that's just one extreme example, but the rest of the examples is there's basically nobody in certain sectors. And I'm in supply chain. I see a ton of opportunity. Nobody's touching. And I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to be good times in Latin America, primarily rooted around that. Also, like once you get in, if there is competition, it's over 50% of the time, the competition is going to be weak. And if you do have a strong competitor, they're primarily strong because they're young guys that are smart, that have good education, but they themselves they haven't done a startup before. And that in itself is rooted in a lot of things that could go wrong for a startup. So there's a lot of areas to maneuver in Latin America. And then another point that I love is a lot of the businesses that you do, you have to win the region, not just one country. Supply chain is a good example. I believe if you do supply chain business, you're in logistics, you need to not only win Colombia, but you need to get to Mexico and Brazil and some other countries over time and win the region. And you certainly see that with Cubbo as well. We can't just be in Mexico. We're working with international brands that want to come in to Latin America and scale through the region and not have multiple 3PL partners. So we can't just sit, do a good job in Mexico and not do anything else about the rest of the regions. And I really love that as well, because it's really hard to expand and do that well. And you can actually use that to then bring it back to a main market where you might not be competing well against a competitor. They might be out competing you. But if you can do a good job across the region, that ultimately can be the main leverage that you need to then overtake them in the market that they're doing well in. So I like to maneuver around the different markets, be feet on the ground, competing. And for me, that's just a ton of fun. Like if I look back on my San Francisco days, it's like, okay, I was like hanging out in San Francisco, building a business that was highly competitive and just trying to win the US. And, it was nice, but so much more fun to be in Latin America, hustling in a market that's just emerging.
Yeah. So just as a recap, you think that from a competitive standpoint, there's less people pursuing the opportunities. There's an abundance of opportunities. One thing we both agree on is the fact that there's some challenges and friction points just living in Latin America. It's actually a feature, not a bug, right? Because you want to be in a market where there's a lot of opportunities and where there's a lot of challenges. That means there's a lot of opportunities, right? So I think we both agree on that.
I think a good example is Brazil. Everybody, it's like, Brazil is a country on its own. Portuguese, why would you want to go in there? It's like, why not? It's like I've done 2 businesses that I had to go through Brazil. I don't speak any Portuguese. And I just got on a plane. I relocated myself and my family there for at least 6 months. And you just start hustling. You just start building a business. And there's different taxes. There's a different language. But I haven't seen anything material that would be able to, maybe it's logistics specific. I don't know. But there is a lot of perceived friction with taxation, with languages, with nuances. But at the end of the day, it's, I don't know. It's not that material.
I think the nuances are completely overblown, and that I think that people like to say, "Oh, it's like this kind of untouchable market." Brazil. Look, it's hard everywhere. It's hard to build a company anywhere, and Brazil. Yeah, the language might be a bit of a barrier, but and it probably depends on your sector. But there's also just a bounty of opportunities there too, right? So I think that it's something that a lot of founders, particularly like Latin American founders that are from Spanish-speaking Latin America, there's a bit of like a stigma attached to Brazil, like it's too hard to get into or it's too difficult. And in my case, there's just ways to navigate it, right? Like find good local partners, make sure you have a team that's super knowledgeable and skillful in the areas that you need, and then just be super focused on solving a huge problem. And just like any other market.
Yeah, I also believe that when you expand a business in Latin America, it has to be founder driven. You can't just slap on like a good country manager and hope that they're going to scale. Because whatever your main market ends up getting over prioritized. And the only way you can kind of deflate that a little bit is if one of the founders gets on a plane and relocates there for at least 6 to 12 months. And really, you have to get the company to at least 100K a month in gross revenue to even think of it not being founder driven. And then I would even probably maybe argue closer to $1 million a month. And then, you can put in a good country manager and then you can go remote. You can go back to Colombia and try to run it into Brazil. But like one of the secret sauces, like one of the founders has to get on a plane and relocate. And if you do that and you do apply the same principles as launching your main country, a lot of the success will come.
There's a handful of companies that I recall and giving the same advice to. Any market that you want to win, you need to be there and prioritize it. And it's a strong statement when the founder moves somewhere and like we do a lot more stuff in Mexico, and I decided to spend a year here, and it's like the depth of network you build and access by being on the ground is notable.
Yeah. But even like internally, it does move the needle for your colleagues to see, okay, wow, this country is a priority where one of the founders is actually living there, which is super important. Otherwise, the main market is just going to get over prioritized, and then the other countries just feel like they're not getting enough attention. And even with the founder there's still a lot to overcome. But that is, I think, is the material move to deflate some of the challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And it reminds me of the example and inspiration I got from Marcos Galperin when he was really trying to turn Melly into like a really product-driven company. And he was like, I'm going to sit in product engineering. So like these kind of leading from the front on these strategic decisions your company is making, send a message to the rest of the organization about what's important. And then everything kind of falls in place after that.
Yeah, lead by example for sure. Absolutely.
Let's go back a little bit. Here you are, you're building one of the first loyalty platforms for sports teams back in 2011. And you've publicly shared that company ran out of money even after raising a few rounds of funding. Why did that happen? What advice do you have for founders? It seems like money is a big topic in 2023. Runway, first slide on every board meeting. Talk a little bit about how people can avoid that same fate that you experienced in 2011.
Yeah. I mean, I would say cash wasn't the reason, even though ultimately we ran out of cash, because we were able to become well-funded. And then we just ran out of cash because we never built a compelling product. But fundamentally, the reasons why that business failed was one, it was just because it was my first startup. And so I definitely, like, no matter how talented you are, having gone through a few cycles now, like, I just realized in looking back, every startup becomes a little bit easier, but ultimately net super tough. But going back to that first business, wow, like how important it is to pull from past experience. And if you're able to get onto that next startup, it's just massively materially easier, even though it's still hard. And so one of the main, if I look back, it's just like stupid first time entrepreneur mistakes. And then also I was a sole founder, which I highly recommend to never do. Being a founder in startups is super tough. Being a sole founder, doing it by yourself is super lonely. I can't imagine like doing it again. But that's another reason I was the only founder I was trying to get involved in a lot of decisions. I was micromanaging a lot of areas, like for instance, with product, I was trying to get in there and actually like lead product, when even today I'm not really that great at product. But back in the day, I was trying to get way over involved in every decision. So I've learned to delegate better and empower your team and your colleagues. And then also the first 10 hires that I made were friends. They were my brother, my soccer buddies, my colleagues that I've had previously that had zero tech experience. But it felt good to all be around the table because we could all grab a beer at the end of the day. But the reality was like none of us had startup experience. And really the core characteristic that we're all good at was doing business development. So massive crossover on everyone's skill. And so I've learned over time to, starting with the founding team, the executive team, like the less crossover you have with personality, with skills, the better. Like if you put all the founders in Cubbo in one room or lifted, I think I've done a really good job, like super different people, little crossover. And I think that's a recipe for success. So that is like some of the areas of why that business failed. And then what I learned there, which comes back to is the reality, even like, much more like tons of years later, is never put all of your eggs in one basket around a financing round. So I thought we had a commitment from a new fund to come in to do our B round. That fell apart in the last moment. And I'm like, oh, whoa, but they like shook my hand to do this deal. Like I had no plan B or C, D. I was just all in on this one fund that had committed to invest to come. They pulled out last minute, and I had no other plan. So I was like, okay, we have to shut down from one day to the next. So that's an important lesson. Even today, I still get a lot of commitments, a lot of handshakes, sometimes signed term sheets they pulled last minute. But now I have like tons of additional plans that I had been thinking all along. Like if they are to pull last minute, what are my other options? But that was one of the main reasons. I was just like, okay, this round's going to happen. I'm good. And then it did fell apart. And then we weren't making any revenue. We had to shut down.
I remember you called me one time and you were up against the ropes. Do you remember?
Yeah.
And you were you're in a tight spot, right? Like this is your last company, and you were like, your options were like fire 90% of the team. This is not Cubbo. This is lift it. Yeah. And I remember you were like, what do I do? Do you remember that conversation?
It actually happened twice at Lift It. Like massive material things happened in the last minutes where it was just like we were out of cash because something happened one way or the other. And those were extremely challenging situations, but I as challenging as they were, by that time in my career, I had a little bit of taste of previous experience where it helped navigate, though those in themselves were brand new experiences with different nuances that I had to navigate through. But yeah, it's like, this isn't really a message broadly to founders. Like people are always going to back out last minute. Perhaps it's just isolated to my experiences, but it is something that happens to me pretty frequently. I feel like I'm pretty good at persevering now, but definitely challenging times when it happens.
Yeah, it's definitely not good behavior by VCs, and I think this call was like a COVID call. I remember because it was like around the COVID situation, which was like an unprecedented situation, right? So like there was a lot of like concern and doubt, and you had that term sheet, and investor backed out, and it was a tough situation. So I don't think this is like a general pattern of most VCs, because otherwise VCs would be out of business. But it definitely does happen under different circumstances. And so I think the message here, if I can kind of paraphrase for you, I think you already said it, but don't put all your eggs in one basket, and make sure you have a ton of investors lined up, and you've got options, and you've got it's funny because I recall this also, like other founders that have relationships and even past relationships where they're like, oh, this investor knows me well, they're going to fund me, like because we have experience working together. And like, even if you have a relationship, don't do that, because it just puts yourself in a weak position, and you don't want to, you don't want to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the reason why I'm always fundraising, because you need to have backup plans for the current round you're doing. You need to have plans for the future round you're doing. So I'm always trying to keep investors updated, so I don't come out of the blues like after someone not hearing from me for 6 months and be like, oh, hey, I need $100K or $1 million. I want to try to stay on top of everyone's mind, whether you're a direct investor or not a direct investor. I try to be as transparent as possible. Now I'm using TikTok as a good platform to be transparent. I also internally, I have like an investor letter strategy where basically I send out every investor letter I send out, I BCC a ton of people that I just want to keep updated that aren't investors or advisors or anything, just people that I've met that I ultimately one day hope that they become an investor. I'm keeping them updated. And that's one good hack of just keeping yourself top of mind. Because the last thing you want to do is like come out of the blue and just like hit people up for cash. For me, fundraising is a personal journey. It's not transactional where I can be like, the YC advice, like, okay, you're going to fundraise for 2 weeks to 4 weeks, go in and out and go back to business. For me, it's never been like that. And it's like, there's a lot of reasons why. And one of them is because I need to, in case something happens with the current fundraising I'm doing, I need to have a backup plan for the investors. That could be another syndicate to make the round happen.
Yeah, I think that's it's 2021. It like increasingly got more transactional because there was, people would just kind of fly into the Bay Area and just be like, I'm here for a week. Term sheets can come in on Monday, kind of mentality. And giving it's a minimum 10-year relationship. That's not how you would choose to kind of build a long-term partnership. Smart to do that. And I think a lot of the things that you typically do, and I follow you on TikTok, and I really like all your content, and I even engage in the comments sometimes, because sometimes people like to make crazy comments, and I'm like, and I come to your defense sometimes because I know you and I know where you're coming from. I'd like to hear from you. What was the thought process? Was like, I'm going to raise in public and create this kind of I'm not questioning it because I'm very aligned with you, and I like to build in public as well. At Latitude, we're very, advocates of that. But I'm curious. So, what was the trigger for you? You're like, I'm going to go ahead and just do this, publicly. For those that don't follow Brian, on TikTok, or I guess that's the main channel. Like, go check him out. He has tons of nice nuggets around, on his journey, and you're super open with what you're doing, and you give a lot of advice. Also, like every kind of little short video you make, there's usually like a little nugget that you try to also kind of share with people. What was the impetus for this? Why did you do this?
Yeah. So I'm always looking for hacks, whether it's like personal development hacks, internal company hacks. And I like to pivot and experiment with a ton of like different things. This is just like one random example, but when I started Cubbo, for the first year and a half, I was the head of marketing running Google PPC, where previously for the other 4 startups that I've done, I've never even wanted to touch Google PPC or touch marketing really. But I'm like, hey, this is the time. I think I see like an arbitrage here where I can actually roll up my sleeves and actually lead the initiative and also learn at the same time, whether that's internal or personal. So I'm always looking for personal hacks as well. And so, but as it is related to TikTok, at the end of last year, we had to download the app at Cubbo. We ran an initiative on the marketing campaign and like do a 15-second video of yourself and explain why you like working at Cubbo. I did that. Had 400 views, and I was like, wow, like there's a lot of people that viewed this video. Is probably like probably not legit data. Like TikTok's probably just inflating the numbers. But then actually, legitimate people reached out and like inquired about my posts, inquired about the business. I'm like, wow, just through one post. And at the same time, I was getting the app was giving me content that was super relevant and interesting to what is interesting to me. And so I'm like, oh wow, there's something here. And so I thought, this was an interesting way where I could possibly get on, talk about, have the angle of being an entrepreneur in Latin America. Fundamentally, the main reason I was like, I want to drive exposure to people being aware of the opportunity in emerging markets and Latin America specifically. I want to be on this platform. I want to be try as vocal as I can to try to drive awareness to the region, which I still do a pretty good job of doing that. And so, and then having started out on the product, I tested many different things. And then basically in January, I had like 10 followers. It was really hard to get going because at the time, I was at my house, which is 2 hours outside of Bogota, only a population of 200 people. And when you start off TikTok, they push, when you don't have a following, what they do is just push locally. So like my housekeeper's daughter came over one day and like she doesn't speak any English. She's like, oh, I see you're on TikTok. I'm like, oh, no wonder why no one's following me, because I'm doing English videos. It's getting pushed out to Tobia, Colombia, where nobody speaks English. I'm like, wow, how am I going to like persevere through this? But actually what I did was like, because I traveled to the US a lot. So whenever I'd go back to the US, I'd save all my videos and just upload them there. And actually that's how I kind of broke out and started to get a little bit of traction on TikTok. But then what ended up happening was I posted just kind of randomly, because I've tested different methods, but I posted myself pitching. And at the time I had headphones on, so you couldn't even hear. It could have been perceived as totally fake. It wasn't, but I was having an investor call, and that blew up to like 70,000 views. And I kind of ignored that at first. I was like, well, like, do people really want to see me pitch? But over time, actually, now that it has become like my main angle, because every time I post myself doing a pitch, like I at least get 10,000 views. Usually I can get to 100,000 views or more just with that style. So I'll continue to do it. And then what I've learned is, like, to my surprise, there's really not a lot of active entrepreneurs on TikTok giving advice, but also being feet on the ground and giving real-time kind of behind the curtain view of what it's like to run a startup. So I'm like, well, let me just kind of let me focus on this niche, and it's been working out pretty well. I didn't want to come into the product and give like general advice, because like I don't want to be the general advice guy, but it seems to be working now on TikTok and ultimately driving value to my main purpose of getting on, which is driving awareness to Latin America and what a great opportunity it is to innovate there.
Well, that's great. I'm a huge supporter of that, and
Thanks.
I think that's a mission that I have also. I'd love to hear what's the most controversial advice that you gave that people were kind of like was most kind of polarizing in your feedback?
Well, it's anytime I post the fact that I believe Latin America is much better to build than the US, I bring that up quite often. That is, I usually get a lot of hate around that, especially in the beginning. Now people like have heard that message a few times, and I get less hate around it. But I think that is one of the topics that people definitely disagree. Everyone, especially if you're in the US, and everyone tries to over optimize on the US.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember one comment specifically around pitching, and it's pitching with a deck or without a deck. And me and you are both super aligned on this. I'm a very not a fan of sitting with the PowerPoint and going through it with a like an investor. I just think it, and this could be stylistic, perspective, because maybe it just doesn't work for me. But I find it so boring. It's just you get no rhythm when you're in a conversation, looking at the slide, and then and it just becomes so dry.
Yeah. And every conversation I have, I go into it just trying to adjust to whatever the energy the other investor is going to throw at me, and then adapt from there. And so I want to have my full focus on that, rather than okay, I have to go to a deck and go through these slides. And so if I'm forced to do that, I think the pitch, especially my style, ends up being very dry. I like to, because a lot of my pitches are very different based on the experience, the energy of the investor. So I just try to open up and adjust and have every meeting be a little bit different.
Yeah, you've got to understand what the interest is. And I mean, even if you are pitching with a deck, if someone asks you about something that's in the deck, you go to that in the deck. You don't say, oh, I'll get there, It's no, the investor's asking about something, just go talk about it. That's what they want to know. So don't try.
Exactly.
I've been in presentations where founders oh, I'm gonna get to that. I just asked about it. I'm kind of curious about it. We can go later, but I might not be that interested later. So it's interesting. I think the key takeaway here is to understand the energy of the meeting, the discussion. What are the main kind of touch points with the investor? How are they engaging with you? And then you've got to adapt and kind of mold based on that flow, right?
Yeah, and I think if you can have that strategy, then you can allow topics to come up. You get to understand the investor a little bit better because they open up, and you can shoot the shit a little bit more. Everything's a little bit different. I want to allow that to happen rather than being super deck focused.
Yeah. One question, there's a interesting post that you did, I recall, where you're $3 million is the perfect valuation for a pre-seed company. I think it's an interesting observation. I want to hear a little bit more if you could expand on why. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit more about those milestones that you kind of really promote in the early days of a company. So maybe you could kind of first give me a bit of sense of why that $3 million is the right valuation for most pre-seed founders that are just starting out.
Yeah, primarily it's driven by experience. So if I look back at Lifted, for instance, we started off at a $3 million valuation, and primarily that was driven because by that time I was on my fourth startup, but it was my first startup in Latin America. And I was super uncomfortable of trying to make it happen because of my language barrier. I didn't know anybody. So I'm okay, let's play it safe at 3 million because that's pretty low. And I did that. And, we ended up, the seed round was $2.2 million. But, we didn't raise the whole 2.2 on 3 million. We stepped up our valuations on the safe. I can't remember what it was, but we went from 3, 6, 9, 10, and beyond.
I paid 6. So I came in right after. And I think it's a really good point because you had momentum already, right? And I was willing to pay a little bit higher price because there was already people that had supported you. You had a little bit of momentum. You had some traction going. And so I think that's it's a lesson that I preach a lot about. It's not about fixing a price, and it's about closing a round with a lead investor, particularly at pre-seed. And so I think that you were an early adapter of that, kind of walking up the valuation based on minimizing supply, increasing demand, and then subsequently adjusting based on where things land.
Yeah, and my lesson learned there is for my whole tenure at Lifted, one of the main things that stressed me out was wow, having to manage the cap table through different funding rounds and worrying about am I between 20 to 30%? So you get to a Series A, B round. By the B round, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, okay, does the founder still have at least 50% ownership on the cap table? If not, that could be a yellow flag. And that was conversations that we had to double click on and get stressed out about because we stuck around too long at a $3 million valuation on that first tranche, and it wasn't even that much money. It was like $300,000, but that like actually materially impacted the cap table forever. And so like as I experienced that, I'm like, why would anyone start below 3 million, even if all you have is a PowerPoint presentation? Because that's basically all we had where it lifted. Because I did that, and it actually caused me stress for 4 years running Lifted, like in different ways, until I left the company. And so it's like, that's why I generally preach today, like, don't go below 3 million. Is basically because you want to manage equity in between rounds. A pre-seed round, in my idea, is the pre-seed round is just like a first tranche of a seed round. So if you put your pre-seed round together with a seed round, you still want to have the same principles of like not going above 30%, somewhere in between 20 to 30. If you can get down to 15 to 20, amazing. But still, you need to put those rounds together. And if you're spending too much time going down to like 1.5 or 2 million on a pre-seed valuation, that kind of like disrupts the whole future stack of dilution.
Is there a risk of going too high?
Yeah, for sure. Especially now. I mean, there's times have changed, valuations have dropped, and then what you're seeing now, a lot of A-round funds, A-round companies had raised at 50 to 100 million, and now they need to. Now that the market has recorrected, now they have this huge disparity that they need to grow into, and like they have a lot of risk of not actually achieving certain milestones to get another round of funding at an uptick. And that still happens at a pre-seed round. Like you can go in too high and not make that much traction, where then you go out to do a price seed or a priced A, you haven't made that significant growth, and then you're kind of stuck in no man's land because your valuation was too high.
I got a couple more questions on fundraising, and then I want to transition to just like operations, sales, getting the engine going in those early days, getting to product market fit, and then scaling up. I recall, I think I read somewhere, an interesting insight that you had, where I think I saw that you'd pitched a San Francisco firm that only does $20 million checks and beyond. And you're not really in a position to take on, a $20, $25 million check right now, maybe very soon, but you're probably too early for this fund because that's their minimum check size, which means they probably want to write a $50 million check. Now, most founders, don't really do that. You get those, you're too early, immediately feedback. What's your rationale for having those conversations? And, I realize you're probably planting a seed for the future, but what do you hope to accomplish in those conversations?
No, it is planting the seed. I mean, in my experience, as we talked briefly previously, in my experience, a funding round and future funding rounds, if you're on this startup or a future startup, it's always a long-term game for me. So like, there's actually a handful of investors that are in Cubbo that I've been pitching since 2006, when I kind of kicked off my initial startup. It didn't really come to fruition to 2008, and then started to raise funding rounds later. But like, I've been pitching some people like since like 2006, 2008. They've been telling me no this whole time, and they finally invested into Cubbo, almost 20 years later. So, for me, like, fundraising is a very long game. So why not plant the seed? You have good practice on pitching to a larger fund. You get to see and pick the brain of what interests them and understand your sector more. Perhaps they're really bullish on the sector, which, this actually happens quite a bit, where they're super bullish on the sector, and you can actually extract why they're bullish, what their vision is. And you can kind of like have reconviction on what you also think and what you're building towards. So I think there's a lot of value that you can gain from those conversations, but ultimately it is planting the seed. And then so when for me, I put them on the investor letter, I put them in BCC, I keep them updated, I follow up with them. So when it is time to raise funding from them at a later date, I'm top of mind, and it's not like I'm just coming out of the blue asking for money like a year or two after not hearing from me.
What would you say to someone that's like, hey man, why don't you focus more on execution? This is something, it's a long game, but like, you got to be able to get to the long game to be in the long game. What would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, this could be sector specific as well, but what I see in logistics is a lot of my pitches actually lead to potential customer opportunities, because they say no, it's not a good fit, but then I do a pretty good job of keeping them updated, and then following up with them one way or the other. And then if I see that they're connected to an e-commerce manager at a customer that I'm trying to get to, then I follow up. Like, I'm pretty relentless on LinkedIn. I'm messaging people all the time, one way or the other, like for one reason or the other. And a lot of the times I'm just hunting for deals. I see that this random investor that I talked to 2 years ago is connected. I'll reach out to them like, hey, hope you're well. And they've been hearing from me this whole time, like, because like just generally I'm pretty good at being transparent and keeping people updated. And then I can leverage that fundraising call to other experiences or to other opportunities, whether it's trying to get a customer. And I also, with recruiting, I try to roll up my sleeves and recruit pretty actively. So like right now I'm running the initiative to find 2 senior salespeople in Brazil. I posted on LinkedIn, there's 300 applications that I'm going to go through. I'm going to filter through because these are critical hires. So I actually want to run the process. And the people that I like and I start to meet with, they give me references, but then I do a ton of cold references. In those cold references are people that, a lot of those people are just random investors that I pitched along the way. That gives me an opportunity to follow up with these investors in a different way. I'm not asking them for money, but I'm like, hey, I'm interested in this person, would love your quick thoughts on this person. And then they're hearing from you like in a different light. And then a lot of times they just want to re-engage and get an update on business. And so this is, some of the reasons why I like
you're kind of mining your network at that point and for other opportunities. I think that's really entrepreneurial of you because, you've got like someone from the outside might be like, oh, there's like an individual reason to do that. And then, you're like, well, actually there's, it's kind of playing 3D chess here. You've got the potential of, capital in the future, but then you've also got an entire portfolio of companies that could become the customer, networks, maybe people that's an LP in the fund that, runs, an e-commerce company that could become a customer. So I get that. And I think that's a wise thing to do. And also like fundraising is an important role as a CEO. If you're not a good fundraiser, you're going to struggle at some point. Unless you're just kind of a rocket ship, then, it doesn't matter how bad you are at communicating. Usually you'll find an investor because the business is just kind of undeniable, but most cases are not like that. It's not a rocket ship, and it has, starts and stops and it's, it's peaks and valleys. Right. So,
also, just like really wrapping up that, I do fundraise a lot. And, when I'm not really, like right now, we're not really fundraising for Cubbo, but I'm at least having one meeting a day, a meeting with investor. When I am fundraising, I'm at least trying to have at least 4 meetings a day. But even like, you could argue that that's a lot one way or the other. But the reality is like, I still get back to, like, I try to block off my calendar a lot, but I still have enough time to get back and do my CEO responsibilities because I have a really strong founding team, a really strong executive team. I've delegated well, and there's 20 fires, but I don't need to jump on all 20 fires. Like even when I'm fully fundraising, I still have time during the day to jump in and try to tackle 1 or 2 fires, which is, all you should really be doing as a CEO, in my opinion. So I don't see any, I haven't in my experience, like over fundraising, I still think you can add all the value and put in all the time you need to do as a CEO.
90% of fundraising on Zoom today, or inverse of that? What's the reality for let's call it a seed or a Series A company?
Yeah, mostly on Zoom. Though if there's an opportunity to do it face to face, I try to optimize for that because I think that's ultimately a better way. I think you can convert more, and even like the face to face meetings that I had, investor meetings when I first started off my career. I've kept in touch with these people much more so than just having a quick Zoom meeting. So I try to, when I can, to do in person, but mostly Zoom.
So let's get back to some of the operation stuff, and then let's take the investor perspective. You've done some early stage investing yourself. What signals are the most important for you, and what would make you give up on investing?
So, for me, because I'm writing small checks, I don't really dig in too much on the opportunity, or like I want to see traction sometimes, but like more for me, I'm just looking, do I have a connection with the founder? Do I see myself wanting to hear and engage with this founder for the next 5 to 10 years? Does the founder have this chemistry, this energy that I can connect with? And actually one of the things that I enjoy most about being an investor is actually being the very first check in. And I try to be sector specific right now because I don't have a lot of time to really be an investor at all. Like I just try to be focused on supply chain logistics, investing in Latin America. Generally, if I come across a good entrepreneur in that space, like I sort of like make a really quick decision to invest. Outside of that, I still use the same principles that I had just discussed. Like 2 examples recently, is a crypto startup in Bogota called Zulu. I was the first check into that. Also, there's an accelerator called Cubbo Ventures in Bogota. I was the first investor into that. In both examples, like I'm not super into crypto or investing into accelerators, but I met with those entrepreneurs. There's a certain chemistry. I saw that they were really dying for that first check. So I wanted to be the first check, like regardless, like I was the first one in, regardless of who was in their pipeline or who was like close to closing. And seeing their reaction when they got their first yes and receiving the first money is, for me, is priceless. And both of those examples, they leverage that to then become, raised from amazing investors and scale the company. It also, like, one example of me being a first check-in is a startup called Hello Token that was a quick fail. This was like 10 years ago. I was the first investor into that. And same situation, like young kid right out of Harvard. I had this connection with him, first check-in. It was a quick fail, it was a quick write-off, like after 18 months. But then now he's one of the general partners at Graph Ventures in New York. He came in early in Cubbo. That was a huge help to us when we first kicked things off. And even to today, he's like, man, like, first thing I remember Brian about is like being the first check into my startup and how much of a huge relief that was and how that then unblocked me to accomplish much more. And so that's my style of investing. And like, I know it's probably not going to have the greatest returns, but it's, especially being in Latin America, it's more like supporting the ecosystem, supporting founders. And because I know how hard it is to get that first check.
And are you investing at a 3 million post?
Yeah, I mean, actually with Zulu, that's exactly the conversation we had. He's like, oh man, like I have this investor, he wants to come in at 1.5. I'm like, man, like let's not even talk about this. Here's a check, 3 million, put me in, and let's go. Now you don't have to have a conversation with another investor of like what my valuation should be. You already have money. Like, don't worry about that.
That's awesome, man. Yeah. Well, really, it's amazing to catch up. Thank you for letting me be on the journey with you now for a second time. It's Absolutely. Really, I think that we have a very aligned way of seeing the market opportunity in Latin America and the importance of, community, helping other founders. It's something that the way you angel invest is kind of how I used to angel invest. Now that we run a fund, I can't be like, oh, I really like the vibe of this person. But
it doesn't scale well.
No, it doesn't. It's got to be something that checks out. And in fact, we have a really good team that leads the investing anyway. So I get to kind of swoop in once in a while and help out and help close the deal or help with the fundraising, et cetera. But well, thank you for making the time, man. It's really awesome. Yeah, and I definitely have been enjoying your content on TikTok, and you're really sharing some valuable advice for founders. Yeah. And so thanks for sharing some of that today.
Absolutely. Thanks. Great to catch up.